I have walked 27 dead worlds. Not scanned them. Not surveyed them by drone pass or orbital array or the clean remote methodology that the Survey Commission prefers now. The one that keeps boots off the rock and liability forms short. I mean walked. Grid by grid, marker by marker. The old boot leather method my first team lead, a woman named Petra Calloway, taught me when I was 23 years old and still thought that the point of planetary survey was the data. Petra corrected me on that on the third day of my first assignment, a cold silicate world in the Cashan outer belt she called gravel because it hadn't been assigned a proper designation yet. She stopped in the middle of a grid walk, looked down at the rock under her boots and said, "The data is the record. The walking is the knowing. You don't know a world from a map. You know it from your feet. A map is what you leave behind so the next person doesn't have to start from nothing. The knowing is yours." I was 23. I didn't understand what she meant. I understand now. I am 54 years old and I have walked 27 dead worlds, and the knowing is in my body in a way I could not remove if I tried. It is in the specific callus on the outer edge of my left boot foot, worn there by 30 years of walking uneven terrain in a survey boot's half-rigid sole. It is in the frostbite scarring across the first 2 fingers of my right hand from a suit heater failure on Varmeth 9, when I spent 4 hours completing a grid because the grid needed completing, and the extraction window wasn't for 6 hours anyway. It is in the sun damage across my neck and the backs of my hands, the particular pattern of a man who has stood on 24 different worlds under 24 different suns, each with its own spectral character, its own angle of incidence, its own slow accumulation on exposed skin. I did not think of any of this as a record. I thought of it as age, the ordinary wreckage that a working life leaves on a body. I was wrong about that too. The Vel Karath was found on the 9th day of a standard reclamation sweep of the canyon systems of Reach 11, a dead world in the outer survey belt, Class D geologically inert, atmosphere marginally breathable in a suit without full seal. Reach 11 had been on the peripheral survey list for a decade. It was not particularly interesting, which is why it was peripheral. The canyon system in the southern hemisphere was on the list because it was anomalous. The walls ran too straight, the canyon floor too flat, and an orbital pass 20 years ago had flagged subsurface density readings that didn't match the surrounding geology. I was assigned to the sweep because I am the Survey Commission's last-generation field surveyor, the last one still operating under the old methodology, still walking grids, still taking manual topographic readings in addition to the automated ones, still filing the kind of ground truth report that takes 3 times as long as a drone survey, but contains 3 times the surface detail. The Commission keeps me on largely because there is a class of planetary feature, subtle subsurface interface expressions, very thin material change gradients, fine structural anomalies, that drone sweeps miss and that my kind of walking catches. They do not keep me on because they particularly value the method. They keep me on because I keep finding things the drones don't. I found the canyon anomaly on foot on the 9th day. The rest of the team, 4 younger surveyors, good at their work, fast with the instruments, committed to the drone-first approach, had cleared the canyon floor to their satisfaction on day 2, and were working the wall face sampling rotation when I came back to the floor because the density readings in the subsurface were bothering me. You can see subsurface readings on a screen. You cannot feel them. I wanted to feel what was wrong with the floor. What was wrong with the floor was that 3 meters of compacted silicate overburden was sitting on top of something that was not rock. We called in the excavation assist, and they cleared the overburden in 2 days, and what was underneath it was a ship. Not a ship the way we build ships, not sleek, not aerodynamic, not designed for atmosphere or landing. A ship the way something builds ships when it has been doing it for so long that function has entirely separated from the aesthetics of function. It was a flattened ovoid form roughly 240 meters at its longest axis, sitting in the canyon floor as though it had settled there deliberately, which it had. The hull material was something our instruments could not fully characterize. Not metal in any alloy we knew, not ceramic, not composite, not anything with a recognizable spectral signature. It was the color of old bone in the canyon light, and where the dust had been cleared from its surface, it had a texture like the grain of very old wood. Fine, parallel, deep. The survey team stood at the canyon rim and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then the commission sent specialists. They came in two waves. The first wave was the materials team, 8 people with instruments that cost more than my annual salary each, and a mandate to characterize the hull material, access the interior if possible, and file a preliminary structural report. They spent 10 days on it. They could not characterize the hull material beyond confirming it was artificial and precursor origin. They found the entry points, 4 apertures spaced around the hull that had opened, apparently on their own, sometime in the first 48 hours after the excavation, and they went inside. The interior, they reported, was intact, structurally perfect, 40,000 years under 3 meters of overburden, and the interior of the ship showed no degradation, no material fatigue, no atmospheric infiltration. The air inside was the same as the day it sealed itself, a precise oxygen-nitrogen mix with trace elements that the team's atmospheric chemists spent 3 days trying to identify and eventually filed as unknown but benign. The ship had kept itself. The second wave was the technology team, and they came for the navigation hall. The navigation hall was the heart of the ship, not in the center of the vessel but in its forward third, a space roughly 30 meters across with a ceiling that rose to the full interior height of the hull, which was 12 meters. The floor was the same bone-pale hull material. The walls were the same, but in the center of the space, rising from the floor to a height of about 1.5 meters, was the chart table. I say chart table because that is the nearest human term. It was a continuous surface, not a flat table but a gently curved form, like a shallow bowl stretched into an oval, perhaps 8 meters at its longest dimension. The surface was covered in a fine, dense network of incised lines that the imaging team spent 2 days photographing, and that the analysis team spent another week trying to interpret. They were not decorative. They were, the analysis team eventually agreed, a representation of something spatial, relationships, distances, positions. A map of something. Of what, they could not determine, because the reference frame was not one they could anchor to any known coordinate system. The chart table was inert, dark. No power, no light, no response to any input the technology team tried. They tried powered interfaces first, standard precursor contact protocols, the kind that had worked on 3 other precursor sites in the last decade. Nothing. They tried passive contact, instruments that simply measured and recorded without emitting anything, on the theory that some precursor systems were sensitive to electromagnetic input and wouldn't respond to anything they read as active interference. Nothing. They tried acoustic stimulus, thermal stimulus, light spectrum stimulus across the full range they could generate. Nothing. After 3 weeks of attempting contact, the technology team lead filed his preliminary report. The navigation system was non-functional, likely due to power source depletion over the 40,000 years of the ship's dormancy, and would require significant additional analysis to determine whether restoration was possible. The team recommended the site be held open for a 6-month follow-on study period, after which a reclamation determination would be made. Then the commission filed the reclamation pre-order, a bureaucratic instrument that sets a site on the track toward commercial salvage if scientific investigation doesn't produce results within a defined window. Standard procedure. The window was 90 days from the pre-order filing date. The technology team packed their instruments and left. The materials team had already left. The younger surveyors on my original team had been reassigned. What remained on Reach 11 was me, a 2-person support crew who maintained the base camp and ran the atmospheric and seismic monitoring equipment, and 90 days. The commission didn't ask me to stay. I asked them. I told them I hadn't finished my topographic report on the canyon system. The anomaly had interrupted it, and there were 3 grid sections on the eastern wall face I hadn't walked yet. They told me I could finish the topographic work and file it before the reclamation window closed. They gave me the 90 days. I didn't tell them I wasn't staying for the topographic work. I want to be honest about what I knew and what I didn't. I didn't know what was going to happen. I had no theory, no hypothesis, no professional instinct of the kind that leads a surveyor to a subsurface anomaly. What I had was something harder to name, a disinclination to leave, a sense that the ship wasn't finished yet. That something about the situation was incomplete, and that if I walked away before it completed, I would spend the rest of my life knowing I had walked away from an incomplete thing, which is the one failure my professional sensibility cannot accept. So I stayed, and every day for the first 2 weeks, after I'd done a legitimate stretch of topographic walking on the eastern canyon wall, I went into the ship and I sat in the navigation hall. I didn't bring instruments. The technology team had instruments in abundance and they'd produced nothing. I brought what I brought to every survey myself: my eyes, my hands, the walking knowledge of 30 years. The navigation hall is beautiful, in the way that a very old and very carefully made thing is beautiful. The chart table's surface, under good light, showed a depth to those incised lines that photographs don't capture. They were not scratched into the surface but drawn through it, as though the material itself had been parted and then closed around the line, leaving a trace that was more like a vein than a groove. When the canyon light came through the entry aperture at a low angle in the late afternoon, the lines caught it and held it, and the table looked like something lit from within. I sat beside it on the second day, and I put my hand on its surface. Not a methodology, not a protocol. Petra Calloway's habit, which had become my habit: when you want to know a thing, touch it. Feel its temperature, its texture, its specific material character. Your hands know things your instruments don't. The table was cool. Not cold, there was no temperature differential large enough to feel significant, but cool in the way that a large mass of dense material is cool. Not the absence of warmth so much as the deep indifference to it. I ran my palm along the surface and felt the incised lines pass under my skin, very fine, very precise, consistent in their depth. I felt the slight grain of the bone-pale material. I felt nothing else. I came back the next day and did it again. And the next, and the day after. I am not, as I have said, a man who mistakes stubbornness for methodology. I knew I wasn't running a protocol. I was sitting with the thing because I was not ready to stop sitting with it, and in 30 years of survey work, I had learned to trust that instinct even when I could not articulate what it was telling me. Sometimes a world shows you something if you give it long enough. Sometimes it doesn't. You don't know until you've given it long enough to find out. What I did in those first 2 weeks was simply be present. I came in the late afternoon after the topographic work, when the canyon light was low and the hall was at its best. I sat on the floor with my back against the lower curved edge of the table, my shoulder against its flank, one hand resting flat on the surface while I read from the field notebook, or reviewed the previous day's topographic measurements, or simply sat and watched the light travel across the lines. My thermals kept me warm. The ship's air sat at its precise 17 degrees. The lines did what they'd always done, which was nothing, which was also something, because a thing that does nothing for 40,000 years and then does nothing for 14 more days is not necessarily going to keep doing nothing forever. I had spent enough time with dead worlds to know that patience is not passivity. You are present and attending, and you do not demand anything, and you do not impose a timeline on the thing you're waiting to understand. You give it time the way you give a world time, knowing it will not yield on your schedule, only on its own. On the 14th day, I brought my topographic notebook, an actual paper notebook, another habit Petra Calloway gave me and that I have never abandoned, and I spread it open on the floor beside the chart table and worked on my field notes while my left hand rested on the table's surface. The light was good. The hall was quiet. My support crew were at base camp, 2 kilometers up the canyon. I was alone with the ship the way I am alone on a grid walk, completely, comfortably, without loneliness. I worked for 2 hours. Then I became aware that the surface under my hand was warmer than it had been. Not dramatically, not the sudden warmth of a thing activating. I had read the technology team's contact logs, and activation events in precursor systems tended to be abrupt, a step change in output that the instruments caught clearly. This was not that. This was the slow, incremental change in surface temperature that you'd get from a large stone mass absorbing heat from a hand held against it long enough. Except the hall was climate-controlled by the ship itself, and the ship itself maintained a constant interior temperature of 17 degrees Celsius, and the table had been 17 degrees every time I'd touched it for 14 days, and my hand temperature was 36 degrees, and I'd had my hand on the surface for 2 hours. 2 hours of contact between a 36-degree surface and a 17-degree mass. The mass should have warmed. Physics said so. It hadn't warmed, not once in 14 days. It was warming now. I did not move my hand. I set down my pencil very carefully in the fold of the notebook because I didn't want the sound of it. I didn't want any sound. I wanted to hear whatever there was to hear, if there was anything to hear. Warming continued. Slow, even, steady. Over the course of perhaps 20 minutes it went from 17 to 22 degrees under my palm, 5 degrees, barely perceptible but perceptible. I have walked dead worlds in suits that measured ambient temperature in tenths of a degree, and I have become, over 30 years, very good at reading temperature through materials. 5 degrees was real. 5 degrees was not physics. The room was 17 degrees. The table had been 17 degrees. There was no mechanism by which it should be 22 degrees now, under my hand, without an external energy source providing heat. The external energy source was me, but not my hand temperature. Something was drawing from me. I sat with that thought for a long time without panicking. Panic is not a useful register on survey work. You encounter anomalies. You do not always understand them. You note them, you continue. You hold the unknowing without filling it with a story before the story arrives. Nothing happened for another hour. Then something happened in the incised lines. It was not light exactly. The technology team had checked the table for bioluminescence, chemiluminescence, photoluminescence, and several other categories of light emission and found nothing. What I saw, what I am going to describe as light because I have no better word, was more like the lines becoming more fully themselves, as though they had been drawn at a depth the eye couldn't quite access, and now, incrementally, they were resolving, coming up, becoming visible in a way they hadn't been before. It was the spatial representation, the map, if it was a map, becoming legible. Slowly, over perhaps 30 minutes, the lines across the full surface of the chart table went from their usual state, fine, precise, present but passive, to something else. Something that carried meaning in a way I could feel without being able to read it. The lines were in the same positions they'd always been. Nothing had moved. But they were different now in the way that a word is different when you finally understand the language it's written in. The shapes haven't changed, but the shapes are now full. I didn't understand the language. I am not trained in precursor linguistics or spatial representation systems, or any of the analytical frameworks the technology team brought to bear on this table. But I had spent 30 years reading topographic maps, survey grids, geological charts, and orbital array outputs. And I know what a representation of space looks like when it is organized by a mind that understands space. And the lines on this table were organized by a mind that understood space, deeply, at a level that made our coordinate systems look like a child's first attempt at geometry. I was looking at a star map, not a representation of a section of space I recognized. Not our local stellar neighborhood, not the survey belt, not any configuration I could match to any chart I'd ever filed, but a star map, a complete, coherent, internally consistent representation of a large volume of space, with relationships and distances, and something that might have been travel routes marked in a second layer of line, finer and more complex, like a web drawn over the primary positional marks. I was looking at every world the builders of this ship had ever walked. I understood that with a clarity I cannot fully account for, not a deduction, not an inference, not a conclusion from data, a recognition, the kind of knowing that lives in the hands. The ship was showing me what it was. It stopped there. The lines held their resolved state for perhaps 5 minutes, brilliant in their suddenly legible depth, and then they quieted back not to dark, not to inert, but to something between, present, patient, aware. As though they'd said, now you know what I am, and now I know what you are, and we can proceed from here. I left my hand on the surface. I picked up my pencil and I opened my notebook to a clean page, and I started writing. Not analysis, not a field report. I wrote what I'd seen the way Petra Calloway taught me to write, a sight observation. Describe the thing as it was, without interpreting, without explaining, without reaching for meaning before the meaning is ready to come to you. Write what you saw. Let the meaning find you. I filled 14 pages. The support crew checked in by radio at 1800 and I told them I was fine and I'd be back at camp by 2100. I came back at 2045 because I stopped writing when I ran out of observations to make, not when I ran out of paper. The table was warm, not 22 degrees more, 24, 25. Warmer than it had ever been. Warmer still under my hand when I lifted it to go. I pressed my palm flat against the surface once, deliberately, before I left. I did that for 30 years on every world at the end of the last grid walk, pressed my palm flat against the rock, the regolith, the canyon wall, whatever the surface was. It was not a ritual. It was not a ceremony. It was the surveyor's equivalent of a nod. I was here. I walked you. I know you now. I had done it on every world I'd ever surveyed. I hadn't thought about it in years. It was simply what I did. The table was warm under my palm, and I could feel the lines against my skin, every line on that 8-meter surface all at once, pressing back. Not literally. The table didn't move, but I felt them the way you feel the grain of old wood when you press your whole hand against it and the grain speaks back through your skin, not information, not meaning, just presence. The deep presence of a very old thing that is no longer passive. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I was supposed to. I walked back to camp in the dark. The canyon walls were 50 meters on either side of me, and the sky above was the particular deep indigo of Reach 11 at night, with its 2 small moons, and I walked the 2 kilometers in my own footsteps. I always walk back in my own footsteps on the last pass of the day, another Petra Calloway habit, and thought about what the table had done and what it might mean. I didn't sleep much. That was fine. I have learned to rest in the thinking, to let the unknowing do its work in the night time when the rest of the mind is quiet. By morning, I had resolved to do one thing differently. The technology team had brought their instruments to the table. They had brought expertise, methodology, analytical frameworks. They had brought everything they knew, and the table had given them nothing. I had brought my hands. I had brought 30 years of dead worlds encoded in my skin. I had brought the old habit of touching things before you try to understand them. And the table had warmed, and the lines had resolved, and something had happened that hadn't happened in 40,000 years. I was going to bring more. The next day I went back to the navigation hall, and I lay my whole forearm on the table. Then my other forearm. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the table's curved lower edge and pressed my shoulder blades against it and let the back of my neck contact the upper surface rim. I want to be clear about what this looked like. It looked like a tired old man slumped against a piece of alien furniture. There was no ceremony in it. I was giving the table more surface, more contact, more of the record that was in my skin, if that was what it was reading. The warmth came faster this time. Over the course of an hour, with the broad contact of both forearms and my neck and the back of my head resting against the upper rim, the table went from 17 degrees to nearly body temperature. 29, 30 degrees across my contact points. And the lines came alive. Not across the full surface this time. They responded in specific sections. I had my right forearm down, and the lines nearest to that contact point resolved first, a cluster of stellar positions and travel routes in the upper left quadrant of the table from my orientation. Then my left forearm's contact resolved a different section. The neck contact resolved something in the center of the table's curve, near what I had begun to think of as the focal point, the place where the lines were most dense, most complex, as though the most important information concentrated there the way a river delta concentrates at the sea. It was reading me section by section. Not all at once, not my gross anatomy, not my presence in the space, my specific contact points, the specific geography of my skin against its surface. My forearms are where I carry the most accumulated sun damage from 30 years of worlds, the backs of them specifically. I tend to work with my sleeves pushed up. I tend to face into the light when I'm working, and the UV accumulation on the backs of my forearms is measurable. My neck carries the same. The topographic survey maps of my own skin, if you made them, would show a specific pattern of exposure and damage and callus and scar that is entirely different from any other person's, because no other person has stood on these same 27 worlds in these same conditions over these same years. The table was not reading my identity. It was not reading my name or my commission number or any stored datum about Dale Morrow, field surveyor. It was reading what was written on me, the physical text of 30 years of walking. I understood this slowly, the way you understand a difficult terrain feature, not with a single insight but with accumulation. Each session with the table added detail to a picture I was building without the full vocabulary to describe it. What I knew was this: the responses were not random. The sections that resolved when I pressed my right forearm were always the same sections. When I shifted my forearm's position by 20 centimeters, different lines came up, not new lines, not more lines, but different ones, corresponding to different coordinates in the map's spatial logic, as though the forearm's position on the surface selected for a specific region of skin, and that region of skin carried a specific record that the table could read. I ran a test on the 5th day of the broad contact sessions, as methodical as any survey protocol I'd ever run. I made a cloth barrier, cut a strip from the fabric lining of my pack, and laid it between my right forearm and the table's surface. Synthetics only, nothing that had been on a world, nothing that carried a biological record. The lines did not resolve under the cloth-covered contact. I moved the cloth, lay my bare forearm down directly. The lines came up within 40 seconds. I ran the test twice more over the following 2 days with different barrier materials, different contact durations, different sections of the table. Every time, bare skin resolved lines, covered skin resolved nothing. The table was reading the skin, specifically. Not warmth, not pressure, not electromagnetic signature. The biological record in the skin itself. I wrote this up in the field notebook that night with the same precision I'd use for a geological anomaly log. I described each test, the materials used, the observation, the elapsed time, the result. 14 tests over 3 days. 14 consistent results. I was not sure what I would do with this information. There was no one on Reach 11 to tell it to who would know what to do with it either. My support crew were good people, technically proficient, not given to speculation, professional in the way that people who maintain atmospheric monitoring equipment on dead worlds need to be professional. They maintained the equipment. I did not want to involve them in something I did not yet understand well enough to describe without sounding like a man who had been alone on a dead world too long. I kept the notebook. I kept going in. The third week felt different from the first two, not in kind but in register, the way a world feels different on the third visit than on the first. The unfamiliarity had been replaced by something else. Not familiarity exactly, something closer to mutual recognition. I knew the table's rhythms by then. How long the warmth took to come on contact, how the lines resolved sector by sector before going full, the particular quality of the focal point's glow in the late afternoon when the canyon light was at its lowest and the hall was quiet. And the table, I believed, was learning mine, my arrival time, my hand placement, my habit of pressing my palm flat before leaving. Whether a 40,000-year-old navigation mind could learn habits in the way I mean is a question I am not equipped to answer. But the warmth came faster each week. That is a fact I logged. There were days when the lines showed me things I hadn't seen before. Not new sections of the map. The full star field had resolved in the broad contact sessions, and its basic structure had not changed. But detail within the map. A second layer of information I hadn't noticed initially, nested inside the primary stellar positions and travel routes. Smaller marks, very fine, that I had taken for texture in the surface's incised lines, and that turned out to be a different notation system entirely. Not spatial positions, something else. The language specialist on the later study team identified them as temporal markers, the builder's notation for time, duration, age. I could not read them then, but I could see them once I knew to look for them, and I spent several sessions in the third week simply cataloging where they appeared, which stellar positions carried temporal marks, which travel routes, which of the dense notations in the central focal quadrant. I drew everything in the field notebook, 14 more pages. If nothing else, I told myself, I was building a record the study team could use. But it was not nothing else. I understood that in the third week, with a clarity that had been building since the 14th day and the first warming. The table was not warming because I had brought the right instrument, or discovered the right protocol, or succeeded where the technology team had failed through superior methodology. It was warming because I had spent 30 years writing a record into my skin that the ship's navigation mind could read, and because I was here, and because I kept coming back, and because when I didn't understand something I sat with it until I did. The table was not responding to my expertise. It was responding to my record, to the accumulated evidence, written in UV and scar tissue and callus, of a body that had paid attention to worlds for a long time. I thought about that in the third week more than I'd thought about anything in years. I thought about what it would mean for it to be true that the builders of this ship had designed its navigation system to read a biological record rather than a technical one, had intended its interface to accommodate a working hand rather than an instrumented probe, had built the chart table to warm for skin and stay cold for instruments, and had then, what? Left it here, sealed it under 3 meters of compacted silicate on a dead world in the outer survey belt and waited. Not waited blindly. The temporal markers in the map, the ones I couldn't read, I began to think of those as a timer, not a countdown, more like a condition. The map stays sealed until the right kind of body arrives, a body that carries the right kind of record, and the record has to be a certain completeness before the navigation mind reads it as sufficient. Not 20 worlds, not 10. A threshold I hadn't determined and couldn't calculate, but that I had apparently crossed somewhere in the last 30 years without knowing it. The ship had not been waiting for me specifically. It had been waiting for whoever showed up with enough worlds in their skin. That thought was humbling in a way that the designation itself, when it came, was not. The designation was weight. This was scale. I was not chosen in any meaningful personal sense. I was the first sufficient body that had made contact. If Petra Calloway had come back to the outer survey belt in her 60s with a few more worlds on her record, it might have been her in this hall. If any of the 11 teams before me had included a legacy methodology surveyor who stayed long enough, it might have been them. But none of them had stayed, and here I was. I sat there for 4 hours on the 22nd day. The table was warm, warmer than it had been before, warmer than body temperature now, perhaps 34 degrees across the full surface, and the warmth had a quality I hadn't felt before, directional, as though it was not simply warm but reaching, oriented toward me specifically in a way that previous warmth hadn't been. And then the center of the table, the dense focal point, opened. Not dramatically, not with a sound or a flash or any of the activation signatures the technology team had been hopping for. The surface at the focal point depressed, very slowly, over perhaps a minute, sinking 2 or 3 centimeters into the table's curved body, and then the material at the center receded outward from that depression in a slow radial movement, leaving an opening perhaps 30 centimeters across. An interface point. A place designed for contact, more complete than a hand on a curved surface. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put my right hand into the depression. The fit was, and I have thought about this many times in the years since, not designed for a human hand specifically. It was not a human-shaped mold, but it accommodated a human hand in the way that a good tool accommodates the hand that uses it. The geometry was right. The depth was right. The contact surface was distributed correctly for the specific anatomical geography of a hand that works. Not my hand in particular, but a working hand. A hand that has done things, that carries the evidence of doing things, that is not smooth and unused and unwritten. My hand settled into the depression and the table closed gently around it. Not tightly, not a trap, not a grip, a closure. The way good soil closes around a planted seed, encompassing without constraining, holding without gripping. The warmth that came up through my hand was not the slow, incremental warmth of the previous weeks. It was immediate and total, and it traveled. Up my arm, across my shoulder, through my chest. Not painful, not alarming. It felt like the specific warmth of standing in full sunlight on a world with a yellow star after a long season on worlds with cooler suns. The warmth of a thing your body has been waiting to feel and finally recognizes. The lines on the full table surface went brilliant. Not the quiet resolution of the past weeks, brilliant, fully lit. Every line carrying light the way a fiber carries light. Completely, along its full length without loss. The navigation hall was lit by the table now, and the light it threw was warm gold, and the star field it showed on its surface was complete and vast, and I could feel that it was the largest map I had ever stood in the presence of. It was not a map of what the builders had explored. It was a map of what they intended. The travel routes were not records of completed voyages. They were projections, planned routes, forward-calculated trajectories, the spatial ambition of a civilization that had seeded its mapping instinct into the species that would come after them, and then drawn out the chart of where those species were meant to go. Not where the builders had gone, where we were meant to go. Where I was meant to take them. The recognition was complete, and quiet and very heavy, and I sat with it for a long time. Then the voice came. I say voice, I mean, a communication arrived. Not through the air, the hall was silent, the atmospheric mix unchanged. There was no acoustic event that my ears could have detected. The communication arrived through the hull material under my hand and up my arm and into my chest, and my body understood it the way a bone understands a sound conducted through the medium it lives in. Not heard, felt. Resonance in the skeleton. A meaning that bypassed language and arrived as meaning directly, and then translated itself, afterward, into words. The way a dream translates itself into words when you wake and try to hold it. 6 words. Cartographer, the skin remembers every world. Not a greeting, not a welcome in the warm, simple sense of that word. A designation. A nomming of what I was, which the ship had determined by reading what was written on me, not my files, not my commission record, not any stored datum about Dale Morrow, but my skin. My specific sun-damaged, frostbite-scarred, calloused, boot-worn skin, which carried the topographic record of 27 dead worlds in a notation the ship could read and I could not. Cartographer. I had called myself a surveyor for 30 years. The commission called me a field surveyor, senior grade, legacy methodology. My colleagues called me the last of the boot leather school, sometimes admiringly and sometimes not. I had never called myself a cartographer because a cartographer makes maps that matter, maps that go somewhere, maps that are for something beyond the filing of a commission record in a database that 3 people will ever read. The ship told me that every map I had ever walked had mattered, that they had been filed in a database that I had not known about, not in the commission systems, not in any human archive. In my skin. That my skin was a record and the record was complete and the ship could read it and the ship knew where we were going. Not we. That weight landed second, and it was larger than the first weight. I had walked 27 dead worlds alone, or in small teams where I was always ultimately alone in the walking, and I had been comfortable with that aloneness. And I had not in 30 years thought much about where it was all going, because surveyors don't ask where it's going, we ask what's here, and we write it down and we move to the next world. That is the work. That has always been the work. The ship was telling me the work was not the work. The work was the preparation. The 30 years of walking, the accumulation on my skin, the specific record written in UV and cold and callous, it was not the product. It was the qualification. It was the thing the ship needed to confirm before it would show me what it was built for. I thought about Petra Calloway, who taught me to walk dead worlds and to touch them with my hands and to know them in my body rather than in my instruments. I do not know where Petra Calloway is now. She retired 15 years ago and I lost the thread of her. But I thought about her sitting on gravel, looking at the rock, saying, "The walking is the knowing." And I thought that she probably didn't know that she was teaching me something older than both of us, older than our species survey program, older than our species' reach into the outer survey belt. I thought about whether she had walked enough worlds to have qualified, whether the ship had been waiting for a body that had walked more worlds than Petra managed, whether there was some threshold of accumulated exposure, some minimum record of planetary surfaces in the skin, at which a human surveyor became readable by the ship's navigation mind as sufficiently prepared. And then I thought about the people who had taught Petra, and the people who had taught them, and how far back the habit went, the pressing of the palm flat, the insistence on walking every grid on foot, the refusal to call a thing known until you had touched it, whether any of them had known what they were seeding forward. I thought about the 11 teams that had preceded me to reach 11, and found the canyon anomaly uninteresting, and moved on. I thought about the technology team and their 40 million credits of instruments, which the ship had given nothing to because instruments don't carry anything in their skin. I thought about the fact that I had asked to stay, not because I had any plan, but because an incomplete thing pulls at me until it completes. And I thought that this specific character trait, the inability to walk away from an incomplete thing, the refusal to file a partial report, the compulsion to give every survey exactly as long as it needs, was perhaps also something the ship had been waiting for. Not the quantity of worlds in my skin, the quality of attention I had brought to walking them. I am not a man given to easy meaning making. 30 years of dead worlds will cure you of that if you had it to begin with. Dead worlds are mostly just dead. The survey reveals what's there, and what's there is mostly geological time and silence, and you file the report and move to the next world, and the meaning, if it's there at all, is in the aggregate. In the doing of it, not in any one find. But I sat in the navigation hall of the Vel Karath with my hand in the interface depression, and the table lit gold around me, and the 6-word designation still resonating in my sternum, and I allowed myself to understand that this was different. 27 dead worlds, 30 years of walking, 14 pages of field notes in a paper notebook on the canyon floor. All of it had been filing toward this room. The chart table waited. The star map held its full resolution on the surface, patient and vast, and I could feel through my hand that the ship's navigation mind was present in a way it had not been present for 40,000 years. Not urgent, not demanding. The same quality the table had always had, in every interaction since the first warming, patient, attendant, ready. As though the ship had been entirely comfortable waiting 40,000 years for the right surveyor to show up, and equally comfortable waiting as long after that, as I needed to decide what to do with my hand in the interface. I thought about the commission, about the reclamation pre-order and the 90-day window, of which I had now used 53 days, about the report I would have to file, the most unusual field report I had ever written, in a career that had produced some unusual field reports. I thought about whether there was a protocol for this. There was not. There is no protocol in any human survey tradition for a moment in which a precursor navigation mind designates you its cartographer and waits for you to take your place at the chart. And then I stopped thinking and did what I have always done at the end of a grid walk. I paid attention to what was in front of me. The map was in front of me, a map of where we were meant to go. 27 dead worlds behind me, a skin full of their record, and a ship that had waited 40,000 years because it needed someone who had walked enough of them to read as qualified. A ship that was not dead, had never been dead, had simply been waiting for the right conditions, not a power source, not a technical interface, not a breakthrough in precursor language analysis. A surveyor. A body that had been to enough places and paid enough attention and touched enough surfaces to constitute, in the ship's judgment, a cartographer. I put my other hand on the table's surface beside the interface. The map moved. Not the whole map at once. A section of it, the nearest quadrant, the region I now understood corresponded to the outer survey belt in which Reach 11 sat, shifted. Routes updated. Two of the projected trajectories that had been running toward the Cashin cluster rotated slightly, as though the ship had been calculating since the moment I made contact, and had determined that some of the routes it had laid 40,000 years ago needed to be adjusted for the 40,000 years of stellar drift that had occurred in the interim. It was updating in real time against my skin's record of where those worlds actually were, not where the ship's original chart had expected them to be, but where they were now. As of the most recent time, a body that had visited them had made contact with the interface. 40,000 years of stellar drift, corrected by a surveyor's sun-damaged forearms. I sat there until the canyon light failed and the hall's own illumination. The table's warm gold, the lines running full, was the only light, and I held the thought that had been building since the 6 words arrived in my sternum and now sat in me with full weight. Petra Calloway was right. The data is the record, the walking is the knowing. She taught me to press my palm flat against a world at the end of the last grid walk. She taught me that you don't know a world from a map, you know it from your feet. She taught me to touch things before you try to understand them. I don't know where she learned it. I don't know how far back that habit goes in the survey tradition, or who taught the person who eventually taught Petra. I don't know whether the survey tradition itself was seeded, whether the old bootleather methodology, the specific insistence on walking every grid and touching every surface and keeping the hand in contact with the world you're trying to know, was transmitted to us by accident or by design. But I know this. The ship's navigation mind had been dormant for 40,000 years, and it had woken for a human body that walked dead worlds the old way and pressed its palm flat against the rock at the end of the last pass. And that is not a coincidence that I can fold into a simpler explanation without losing something essential. So I hold it as it is, a fact I cannot fully account for, filed in the same place I file the things I cannot yet explain, which is the same place Petra Calloway told me to put them when I was 23 years old and still thought the point of survey was the data. Wait for the meaning, she said. It will find you. She was right about that too. I filed my report on day 61 of the 90-day window. It ran to 40 pages and included 14 pages of field notes from a paper notebook, a summary of the table's response patterns across 22 days of contact, a detailed log of the barrier cloth tests and their consistent results, a technical description of the interface depression and the nature of the contact event, and a 6-word transcription that I had checked for accuracy 3 times before I let myself write it. I recommended the reclamation pre-order be withdrawn. I recommended the Vel-Kareth be classified as an active precursor system. I recommended, in a section of the report I had rewritten 5 times before I was satisfied with the language, that the Survey Commission consider whether the methodology question, the old boot leather walking versus the drone and instrument approach, was worth revisiting with more urgency than it had previously received, and what it might mean, going forward, that the qualifications the ship had required were the qualifications that methodology produced. The Commission responded in 11 days. They withdrew the reclamation pre-order. They classified the site. They assigned a study team. They did not revisit the methodology question in their response, but they did include, in the cover letter of the assignment paperwork, a line that I have read enough times now to have it by heart. Surveyor Morrow is requested to remain on site in an advisory capacity for the duration of the initial study period. Advisory capacity. I had been a field surveyor for 30 years. I had never been asked to advise anyone on anything that wasn't the content of a topographic report. I accepted. I am still here. The study team came with instruments and analytical frameworks and precursor language specialists and spatial representation theorists, and a team coordinator who was 29 years old and absolutely certain of the right approach. They were good people, serious, committed people. The spatial representation theorist cracked the coordinate notation in the first 6 weeks, which was a genuine breakthrough that I could not have achieved in 30 years of trying. The precursor language specialist translated the stellar designations on the primary map over 3 months of careful work, and some of what she found I cannot describe yet, because the Commission hasn't decided what to do with the implications. None of them could warm the table. None of them could resolve the lines. The table stayed dark and patient under their instruments, the way it had been dark and patient under the technology team's instruments, the way it had probably been dark and patient under the hands of any number of visitors over 40,000 years who were not what it was looking for. I go in every morning before the team arrives. I put my hands on the surface and the lines come up and the map resolves, and I walk the star field with my palms the way I walk a planetary grid with my boots, slow and methodical and paying attention. The study team has their sessions with the table in the documented dark, working from photographs and the spectroscopic record and the translated notation system the language specialist built. And every morning before they arrive, I give the table what it actually needs, a body that has walked enough worlds to qualify, present and attending and touching the surface. I have not yet moved the map in earnest. I have laid my hand in the interface depression, and the map has shifted and updated, and I have felt the weight of what that means, what it would mean to begin navigating it deliberately, to start directing the ship's intent rather than simply confirming my presence to it. I am not in a hurry. 30 years of dead worlds taught me that the work takes the time it takes, and the survey that is rushed is the survey that misses the thing under the overburden. There is no overburden left here. The ship is fully open to me. The map is fully legible in the morning light that comes through the entry aperture and catches the lines at their resolved depth. The ship waits with the same patience it has always had, the patience of a thing that waited 40,000 years, and is prepared to wait a reasonable while longer for its cartographer to understand the full weight of the chart before he begins. I think about the young people on the study team, the spatial representation theorist with her coordinate notation breakthrough, the language specialist with her stellar designations, the coordinator with his certainty and his speed and his very good instruments. I think about what it would mean for them to walk enough worlds to write a record in their skin. I think about whether the survey tradition will still exist when one of them is 54. Whether someone will have taught them Patrick Calloway's habits by then. I have started spending the last hour of my morning sessions talking, not to myself, to the table, to the navigation mind which I believe is listening in the way that the ship has always listened, patient, selective, reading what is written rather than what is said. I tell it about the worlds I have walked. I describe them the way a surveyor describes terrain, concrete, precise, without embellishment. The canyon walls of Varmeth 9 with their igneous striations. The particular silence of the Cashan silicate worlds at midday, when the thin atmosphere carries almost no sound, and you can hear your own footfall as though from a distance. The way Reach 11 sky colors in the hour after dawn, a deep blue-gray that shifts to something almost violet before the sun rises high enough to bleach it out. I do not know if the navigation mind understands these descriptions, but the table is warm while I talk, and the lines stay resolved, and I think that what I am doing is what I have always done on survey, giving the world time, letting it know I'm here, paying the kind of attention that doesn't demand anything in return. 27 dead worlds behind me. A map on the table that shows where we're meant to go. I press my palm flat against the surface at the end of every morning session, the way Petra Calloway taught me to press it flat against the rock at the end of the last grid walk. I was here, I walked you, I know you now. The table is warm under my hand every time. The lines hold their full resolution, patient and precise, showing me the same vast intended star field they've shown me every morning for 2 years. It does not dim. It does not grow impatient. It waits the way it has always waited for the cartographer to finish understanding the chart before he begins to navigate it. I know it and it knows me, and the morning light runs gold through every line. The work is not finished yet.